He- hel- Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor Ola Olsson. Hello, Ola. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm fine, thank you.
Ola, I've been reading your papers for a while, and though you are an economist, you seem to like history. Why is history so important, Ola?
Yeah, I think that without history, you cannot really understand the huge differences that prevail today in terms of differences in economic output or even in other indicators of economic welfare. So without history, you simply cannot use, for instance, current policies to understand these enormous differences. So history is necessary, I think.
Yes, Ola, and the late Professor Alicina reminded us so well.
Yes,
Yes,
he was really a pioneer in political economics.
so for example, he did a study that's quite famous. He argued that the use of the plow is linked to gender inequality in modern day societies.
Yes.
Yes, I was a big I was a big fan of Professor Alicina. But
Yes.
Ola, you have done research on the long run determinants of economic growth, the Neolithic Revolution, and on colonialism. I would like to start with your paper titled The Long Run Cultural Divergence Evident from
Mhm.
the Neolithic Revolution.
Yes.
Yes, tell us a
So
little
so
about it.
yeah. So this builds upon previous work that I've also had on understanding the impact of the transition to agriculture, the Neolithic transition to agriculture, around 10, 11,000 years ago in Near East, and how that impacted on later development levels in the western part of Eurasia, meaning Middle East, Europe, and so on. I also had a previous paper on that, which built on the ideas of Jared Diamond's book,
I was just about to
God's
ask
Germ
you about
System.
your Jared Diamond paper. I think you should give us some background information. So refer to your 2005 paper that confirmed the ideas of Jared Diamond.
Yeah, so in that paper, Diamond argues, or in his book, Diamond argues that an early good access to suitable plants and animals for domestication during the Neolithic meant that certain regions, i.e., those in the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, they made an earlier transition to agriculture and hence started on a development path earlier than other parts of Europe and the world. And that this in turn would explain why it was the case that Europeans colonized the rest of the world, simply because they had had access to these suitable plants and animals for agriculture, which then meant that they had a kickstart in development. So that was the kind, and we had a paper where we showed that this seemed to be the case for most countries in the world, that those who had a good access to suitable plants and animals for agriculture, that they are even today richer. But if you look at within agriculture zones where agriculture spread, we looked then at the Western Eurasia, meaning Europe and the Middle East and North Africa. We see that there's actually a reverse pattern in the sense that countries that made the transition last, like in my own country, Sweden, and other Scandinavian regions, they are now much richer actually than the places where agriculture was invented, like in Iraq and Lebanon and so on. So we found that intriguing. So on the whole, Western Eurasia was richer than other parts, but at the same time, within the Western agriculture zone, the countries that made an early transition are actually poor. So that was the kind of starting point of our analysis
Yes,
in this
and
paper.
so for example, to make it a bit more realistic to our audience, I'm going to mention Egypt. We're all familiar with the exploits of ancient Egypt, but today, relative to the West, Egypt is not successful.
No, no. So Egypt is poor, Iraq is poor and in disarray. Iran is relatively poor and so on. They live to of course, a great extent on oil, whereas some of these very late countries, like Sweden. I mean, we did not have a state here until the 12th century, where we were a completely backward place for most of history, but are now much richer. So there, at some point, there seems to have been a reversal happening, and this is what we study in our paper.
Yes, and Professor, could it be a function of agricultural economies in the sense that in the pre-modern world, collectivistic traits are important, but as we evolve, we become more individualistic, innovative, and open to new ideas, whereas agricultural societies tend to be constructed around irrigation, and this selects for conformity and sometimes authoritarian administrations. And the latter part was actually proved by Bugles in a research paper. So I guess that Wittvogel has been vindicated. What are your thoughts?
Yes, we have primarily two explanations. The first is that the people who first made the transition to agriculture tended to be collectivists. They needed to switch from a lifestyle of hunter-gatherers, where you can just take off when you're not happy with the group, to become instead kind of living in agricultural villages that are crowded, where you can't easily escape, and where someone typically rules over you, a chief, or eventually potentially a priest or a king. So for some reason, these people were kind of domesticated also in actually accepting that kind of conditions. And we argue that it's quite likely that the people who did not accept those conditions, who were more individualist minded, they were the ones who started the migration towards the northwest. So they founded new agriculture colonies. And these new agriculture colonies in, say, Turkey and eventually Greece and other places, here also crowded agriculture villages, eventually states would arise, and then more individualist-minded people would take the migration further until they eventually reached Sweden and Iceland and Scandinavian countries, meaning that even today there is this trace of individualists leaving the old agriculture core. And that seems to be actually well in line with what we found in the data, because we know that these northwestern countries are a lot more individualist today in the way they think than the countries in the Middle East. And this also had an impact on, for instance, rate of innovation, rate of capitalism, and the acceptance of democracy.
Yes, Ola, you may go ahead.
Yes, and then so we think that this is also related then to a second type of political institutions that are related to democracy, economic freedom, and so on. So because we know that individualism is typically related to these kinds of ideas. So initially it was a disadvantage to be a very late, to have made a very late transition to agriculture. But eventually, it would mean that in places like in the northwest of Europe, due to the lack of these very extractive institutions, the lack of collectivist culture, meant that they earlier made a transition to democracy and the other types of individualistic related institutions. And these in turn became an asset, especially during the industrial era, which meant that it was these countries that made the transition to modern industrial economy first, and hence are now richer than the countries in the Middle East.
Yes.
So there was this reversal.
Yes, I would love to read this snippet in your article. People in regions that made a late transition to Neolithic agriculture instead value individualism, have a sense of control of their lives, and tend to live in stable democracies. Yeah, it sums up your research. But Ola, yes. Robert Putnam some time ago said that Italian city-states are shaped by their history. And some years ago, an economist actually found that there is a relationship between the prosperity of city-states in Italy and social capital today. So Professor Olsson, is there also a link between agriculture, individualism, and urbanization, in the sense that is individualism accelerating urbanization, or did it accelerate urbanization back then?
Yes, I think it in some ways might have done that. I think the Italian city-states, they're part of actually within Italy pattern that we also find that that there seems to be the case, for instance, we know it's the case that southern Italy, where there was an early transition to agriculture, are still poorer than the northern parts. So we see that kind of gradient also within Italy. We see it within France, within Turkey, and some other countries, that places that made early transition are now poorer and tend to be less individualistic. In the case of the northern Italian states, I think one should also recognize the role of the Holy Roman Empire, which follows like a corridor through Europe with very independent states and very independent city-states actually within the Holy Roman Empire. So I think there are some other explanations also for why some of those states flourished, also due to trade with the Islamic world and so on. But I think it's part of the same broad pattern actually.
Yes,
in many ways.
there is a positive relationship between proximity to the Holy Roman Empire and development, in the sense that the Holy Roman Empire had better institutions and stronger bureaucracies.
Yeah.
That scholars have recognized that effect. Ola,
Yeah.
you are a researcher. I love the quality of your article, so I'm going to pose a challenge. In Latin America, Asia, and Africa, some contend that there is a relationship between pre-colonial centralization and modern levels of development. But Ola, I would love for you or someone else to do a paper replicating the findings of Louis Putterman. So, for example, regions in Africa with a longer history of statehood today, are these regions richer? The research apparently is telling us that there's a relationship between centralization and modern development, but I would love to see research more along the lines of what Putterman did to replicate the findings for Africa.
Yes, I actually have a few papers with Louis Putterman, and where we look at the relationship between state history and well, also transition to agriculture and states, but also the long run impact of state history. So maybe that kind of research goes some way along what you're looking for. But I agree. I mean, Louis has done a lot of interesting stuff in many parts of the world. So I'm sure there's room for more work on that.
Yes, and another point again, Olson, is that in Potterman's research, I think it's of very high quality, but he should pay more attention to institutional expertise. So, for example, I contend that statehood is a function of complexity and a successful society. Therefore, maybe the relationship is not really between statehood and development, but between institutional expertise and development. More innovative nations were likely to form states.
Sure. Yeah. No. I mean, there are other things that matters certainly. It's probably hard to measure that kind of expertise. I don't think I've seen such a measure, but I'm sure there's. I'm sure there will be people studying this as well.
Yeah, that would be groundbreaking research. So, for example, when we compare Africa and Latin America is more innovative. So could it be a function of its history and its relation to the Aztecs and the Mayans?
Yes, I think there's some. I mean, there were very advanced civilizations in Latin America and in South America. We know. I'm actually studying the Maya on the Yucatan Peninsula that were very advanced in many ways. They had a calendrical system. They had a kind of writing and a very advanced water management system and so on. So there were more of that kind of advanced societies above tribal level than we've seen in Africa. And also I guess they've had a longer time of adjusting after colonialism. One should keep in mind that many of the former colonies in South America and in Latin America became independent already in 1820s, and have had some time to kind of mature as independent states. Whereas in Africa, most of independence happened around 1960. And there's still some of these current states are very unnatural in terms of ethnic heterogeneity and so on, and they're still trying to kind of find their way, I think. Although African countries are also right in the last 10 years to some extent converging actually in terms of income levels, but they're a bit behind some of the Latin American and South American countries in that regard, of course.
Yes. No, Professor, I did not invite you so we could talk about Africa, but Africa is a strange puzzle. And personally, what do you think about the prospects of Africa? Recently, I had on a guest, Alexander Armand. He's interested in free trade. He's actually building an institute to promote free trade in Africa, and he's very upbeat. What are your own prospects?
Oh, it's very different, I would say. Different parts of Africa. I've worked, for instance, in some of the places where conditions are the most difficult. For instance, in Democratic Republic of the Congo, their challenges are huge, and it's also such a huge country. For instance, it's extremely difficult to integrate different parts of the country there. Levels of development are very low, and also there's a recent conflict that complicates things, or many conflicts, I would say, in the Great Lakes area. So it's really I mean, it's a few countries do well. I think Rwanda is doing well. For instance, they have a very autocratic regime. So democracy is certainly an issue there, but they're doing well economically. So it's very different countries. So I think on the whole, you tend to see that African countries are converging slowly in terms of income levels, but it's a fragile process. We knew that Ethiopia had, for instance, very high growth rates, also starting up manufacturing industries and so on. But then came this recent conflict within Tigray. So there's very often 2 steps forward, 1 back, 2 steps forward, 1 back, and then some country falls through, which you didn't expect, whereas others surge ahead, which you wouldn't expect either. So it's a very heterogeneous picture for Africa. But of course, I see no particular reason why they should not catch up like other countries. I don't think there's any inherent disadvantage forever for Africa. Absolutely not. I think it's a young population, very energetic population that really strives for democracy and prosperity. And I'm always optimistic, and I'm optimistic for Africa as well.
Yeah, I'm optimistic for some. Yes, so I am optimistic for some African countries like Rwanda and Ghana, but Africa needs more urbanization and more individualism and less tribalism.
Yes.
Tribalism is still a problem in Africa. So, for example, lineage societies are still prevalent and influential.
Yes.
And the fact that Westerners were able to transcend tribal identities gave the West an edge. So I think that's a problem that Africa must overcome.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, some of these states are extremely unnatural. I think and so we should remember many European states. I mean, like Germany, for instance, there were of course many German-speaking people in Germany, but they have very different dialects. Also in terms of Italy and so on. But gradually, after decades and maybe hundreds of years of unification, you will see a kind of national institutions rising. You see, for instance, in Tanzania, where they've all the time have been very keen on emphasizing the importance of Swahili language. Eventually, everyone seems to converge to speaking Swahili, for instance, and I would assume that eventually this leads to a Tanzanian kind of identity and a sense of not identifying with ethnic groups to the same extent. And so in that sense, I think tribalism will decrease, but it also depends on politicians. In Kenya, for instance, every year when there's an election, then political leaders choose to emphasize ethnic divisions because it suits them politically and it mobilizes their own voters. So I think ethnic identities among hundreds of groups will decline, and that will be good for the formation of states, but it will take time. But it always takes time. Similar processes have been around in Western countries.
Yeah, yes, I do agree. And another obstacle to development in Africa, again, is the issue of property rights. Land is still viewed as a communal asset. So, for example, Thomas McCaskey, in an article on the Asante Empire, opines that the Asante were passionate about wealth, but they viewed it as a communal property. Africa has matured, but as we discussed earlier, urbanization is not growing as rapidly as we would like. So in villages, the issue of communal land is still highly problematic.
Yeah. And this, I'm actually studying this also in another project where we look at the importance of cadastral systems.
Yes, I was just going to refer to that paper, Land Property Rights, Cadastres and Economic Growth. Go ahead.
Yes, so there my co-authors, who are political scientists, have traced the development of cadastral institutions across all countries in the world. For some countries, and cadastral institution means that there's a central land registry, a mapped land registry that shows in a very detailed sense who owns what and what is the border of a certain piece of land, for instance. And this is very important because then it's only then that you can actually use your land as collateral. You can sell or lease out your land and so on. And we show in our paper that this seems to be associated with economic growth, and also other papers have shown that. We show it for all countries in the world, but for Africa, many of these countries there still do not have a cadastral system, and it's pretty difficult to develop one. One should keep in mind that also fiscal institutions having an efficient system of taxation, these types of institutions are pretty hard to construct. They don't come from nothing. So I think it's important that there will be cadastral systems in African countries. It's only then that they can kind of escape from the communal land holding system, which I think is a drag for agriculture development in many ways.
Yes, but we must reconcile the indigenous culture of Africa with property rights. Remember, some countries have a sharing culture, other countries have an individualistic culture. So for example, though property rights are crucial to development, some elders in African societies may argue that property rights represent Western capitalism and they prefer a form of African utopian socialism.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that would be the case. And this was once again the case also in many European countries, for instance. There was a great resistance to this efforts of measuring everything and putting all land and in a certain land registry, because that also increased the prospect of taxation. From you could more easily have land taxes, for instance, in many European countries, often with the purpose of getting taxes and soldiers for the big European wars. So there's certainly drawbacks. This will be a prolonged, difficult process, and it will break down some traditional structures in Africa. So it will not be an easy process, but I think it's necessary for agriculture to take off.
Yes, I think that insecure property rights impede the intergenerational transmission of wealth. So, for example, John Brown
Yeah.
has 2 children and he owns 500 acres, but he has 10 cousins. John Brown did not create a will, and as such, for years, relatives either fight over the land or they just ignore it.
Hmm. Sure. And you talk about urbanization. I think communal landholding basically means that you need to be physically present and cultivate your land. Otherwise, someone else will be assigned to that piece of land. So it means that even if you're a very smart person who would be maybe better off in an urban sector, maybe being a teacher in a school in a city, or maybe even being a manager in an industry, then you can't really leave your land because of these communal property rights. Whereas if you have formal rights to land, then you can leave, keep your land or maybe sell it, and you will have your assets intact. So in this sense, many people believe that stronger private property rights might also boost urbanism in some ways, which is not necessarily always good either, because as we know, some of these urban some of the big mega cities in Africa have huge challenges in many ways. There are big slums, growing slums, and also environmental issues in those cities. But it's yeah, it's a process that's going to go on in Africa for several decades.
Yes, but back to the broader concept of economic development, property rights are crucial, but some articulate the position that in medieval England, property rights were secure, yet we didn't experience an industrial revolution.
Mm.
So, other than property rights, what else do we need to grow economies? Actually, Luis Angelis has an interesting article on the topic. He admits that property rights are important, but he also opines that Europe had relatively secure property rights in some areas, yet they weren't overly innovative.
No, so I think it's many ingredients, and I think economic historians have studied this for many years. I mean, clearly in Britain there were also access to certain natural resources, like coal was probably important. Also as you say, the certain types of innovations were of course central. Also, access to world markets eventually were important for industrialization. So I don't think property rights alone can do it. There are many things that need to kind of connect in order for a successful development process to happen. But I think so each country in a sense will be unique, of course, and each country probably has its own mix, but they typically have these different types of ingredients: access to world markets, some kind of transparent leadership, private property rights, and an openness to trade, openness to new ideas. These are, I think, more or less important for all such transitions to happen.
And perhaps another factor is the scarcity versus affluence mindset, in that affluent countries are more optimistic and innovative, and poorer countries suffering from scarcity tend to be less innovative and less positive about the future. And this can compound the underdevelopment of states.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I think it's been described. I mean, this is also I think you can observe on an individual level, and there have been some interesting research in behavioral economics showing that poor people, for instance, have to think all the time about just making, staying alive more or less, and and finding money to buy food for the next day, short-term jobs, no long-term planning. They sometimes also have to neglect children and so on. So it's easy to get caught in a development trap in that sense, that hinders your personal development. In a similar way, countries on a more macro level can get stuck, I think, if there's just a constant struggle for to survive this or that calamity. And it is sometimes called a development trap or a poverty trap, of course.
Yes. It is the battle between a future-oriented mindset and a present-oriented mindset. Working class people tend to express the latter.
Yeah.
Because they don't have a choice. They're residing in very harsh environments.
Yes.
So obviously their life chances may not be as great as people like us.
Yes.
But it's really interesting to study national differences in culture and individual variations in how ordinary people view life and the impact of these wider ideologies on economic performance.
Yeah. I think, the easiest one to distinguish is like meaning that individualists tend to believe in their own capacity. They believe that if their success in life depends on their own agency in a sense, not on fate or something else. Whereas collectivists have the more or less the reverse view. They also tend to be more relying on authorities rather than their own capacity. These differences can show up in many different dimensions that have been measured by people. Also, as you said before, the views of obedience versus independence and so on. And they also, of course, related to some extent to religion, as many other writers have observed. But there are also other ingredients, of course, of these cultural norms that are important.
So, for example, individualistic countries are more likely to adopt technology, and even countries in Europe that are viewed as collectivistic by outsiders, according to the World Value Survey, are value autonomy, like Denmark and Sweden, for example.
Yeah, many people would, I guess, think of Sweden as collectivistic in the sense that they, for instance, social democracy has been strong, and big welfare state. It's similar in all the Nordic countries, but this is actually based on very strong individualist views, and which also imply that interpersonal trust is extremely high in these countries. And this is another feature of most individualistic societies, that they actually trust their neighbors. They don't mistrust them in the same way as people would do in say southern Italy, for instance. And this also means that they trust the state to a much greater extent, which is another reason why these welfare states could grow so big. So it has many implications beyond those that you first think of.
Yes, individualistic societies are actually less corrupt, according to a new study published by a Cambridge journal. And I am not surprised, because if you live in an individualistic society, you're going to judge your neighbor as an individual. You will not associate him with a tribal or a political identity.
No.
And they actually are more likely to grow and are innovative. And again, if you're individualistic, you will deviate from the norm. So I guess this is why they're more innovative.
Yeah. No, that's true.
Yes. But Ola, there's also another rather riveting paper you wrote. It's titled A Western Reversal Since the Neolithic. A Western Reversal Since the Neolithic, the long run impact of early agriculture. Tell us a little about this paper.
Yes, it's actually related then to what I alluded to before regarding. So it starts off with this kind of basic analysis in Jared Diamond's work that it should be an advantage to have made a first transition to agriculture. But what we show in that paper is that there is within the Western core area, Western Eurasia, there is a negative relationship between time since transition to agriculture and contemporary incomes. So in that sense, we argue that, and along similar lines as this other paper on culture, we argue that an early transition to agriculture implied a more extractive types of institutions, more collectivist culture, which in turn was not good for future prospects of democracy and for more capitalist types of institutions, which around 1800 or after 1800 became crucial for economic development. So in that sense, it was an advantage to be a laggard, like some of the Nordic countries that are now much richer than the Middle Eastern ones.
Yes, I think the captivating point from your article is that earlier developments in agriculture are associated with extractive states. Yeah, I would like you to talk a little about this point.
Yeah, and I think there's many different reasons for this. One is the case that these early regions in the Fertile Crescent, meaning contemporary Syria is another country, of course, where agriculture was extremely early, which is now in chaos. We have Egypt, somewhat later transition, but also Iraq, of course, very early, Iran, Lebanon, and so on, and also Israel, which is a bit special because it's a much newer state in that sense. But in those places, there were many, they were for a very, very long time exposed to these collectivist institutions. So in a sense, the collectivist culture has been ingrained to a greater extent. Those who didn't like it, they migrated and started colonies in the Northwest. So in that sense, it's been, we argue that over history, it's been kind of purified of individualists due to self-selective migration. But we think there are also other reasons. The fact that the Middle East is really at a crossroads of influences from different places, and it's also crossroads of people, of invading armies. And we know that Fertile Crescent has been very exposed to invasions from other places. We know that Mongols invaded, as well as other tribes around in the Middle East. So there's this constant threat of invasion of the very rich cities. So this means that many of these states have always been on a kind of military alert. And we know that militarization is often also associated with more autocratic rule. So we think this is another reason, actually. Furthermore, we think there's potentially another reason, and that's explained by disease. We know that contagious disease requires that people live in close proximity. And we know that this has happened the people have lived in close proximity in the Middle East, in cities for many, many thousands of years. This in turn means that you're more prone to that kind of disease, like the plague and different variants of other diseases. And you eventually realize that it's actually problematic then to have outsiders coming in, because they might bring a disease of some sort. So we became more suspicious of outsiders also for that reason. So that means that openness is lower, and you tend to stick with your own people. And all these things, I would say, contribute to having a more collectivist, autocratic type of culture, autocratic institutions. The later aspect here of disease, the importance of disease, is actually it's called the parasitic stress.
Yes.
And it's actually associated with some other researchers, but this is a common
Corey
theme.
Fincher and Thornhill.
Yes, Finch one.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the parasitic stress idea. And even today with COVID, we're recognizing that people are less likely to trust those who are skeptical of
Yeah.
pro-COVID research. And
Mm,
we tend to react hysterically if one does not want to, if one refuses to wear a mask, or
mm,
if due to his understanding of the science, he's against taking the vaccine. So
yeah.
COVID is actually promoting conformity.
Mm, exactly. So I think we can observe some right now some of these factors that have played out repeatedly in history.
Yes.
Yeah.
But Ola, are extractive institutions always negative? Some researchers suggest that predictability is really important. So even if an institution is extractive, if the elites acknowledge the predictability of the institution, then they're more likely to invest and innovate. So extractive institutions can impede growth, but growth can occur despite extraction.
Yeah, this is. I mean, the concept of extractive institutions is most associated with Darren Acemoglu, Jim Robinson, but it's also been adopted by the World Bank more or less to describe situations where property rights are weak, where government, I mean, the rule of law is weak, and that where governments can basically steal from their citizens in a non-transparent manner. And I guess the counterexample of potentially good extractive states would be China then, where you might argue that they've had this fantastic growth for a number of decades now, and that they seem to be doing well, and that seems to be a model for some other countries. I mean, clearly we will see. According to Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson, this kind of country, this kind of state will not persevere in the end because it's clearly not democratic. There's no respect really for rule of law. It's very collectivistic. I think in some, I mean, clearly, just like the early civilizations were collectivistic and had fantastic progress for a while, I think China can have fantastic progress for a while, but in the longer term, this lack of freedom, this lack of openness, this lack of influence from abroad, this lack of respect for basic human rights, I think that will be a major problem for China. And it will also eventually become a drag for their economic development. The key thing will be when they enter, and which they already try to do, of course, the more innovative part of their development stage. And we will see if innovation can keep up. They're good at manufacturing. I'm not so sure that they will be as good at innovation.
Yes, according to CSIS, the Chinese are still trailing behind the Americans in terms of technology. I am predicting that China may become an upper middle income country, and it will be trapped in the vortex of upper middle income communities, because
Mm.
sustained economic growth requires radical innovations. So for
Yeah.
example, manufacturing is closer to collaborating and collectivism than individualism. But
Mm.
Silicon Valley and other network hubs require dynamism in thinking. So I'm predicting that China will be trapped in the upper middle income range for a while.
Yeah.
And
No,
based on what, let me continue for a second. Based on what we have been observing, China is a rule by law state, not a rule of law state, and the Chinese people embrace legalism, rule by law. So I doubt that they will change anytime soon. But continue.
no, I agree. I think, I mean, you can certainly, and we know that. I mean, China's had a fantastic also history in terms of being a very advanced civilization for many years. But I think in order to reach these, you know, the super innovative kind of stages of development, there's no other way than actually being a free society and letting people be free in several ways. Also by destroying rents, by allowing creative destruction, as many people have pointed out. This old idea from Joseph Schumpeter that what characterizes capitalism is really that one type of new types of firms with a new innovation, they actually destroy the rents of other firms, and thus can be a very painful process. But it's a natural process in capitalism. Let's see when that happens to government-led firms in China, whether China will accept that kind of creative destruction. I'm not so sure. And if they don't accept it, then there's a big risk that they will be stuck, because that's a painful but necessary part of development.
I concur. And furthermore, inherited wealth does not grow as rapidly as self-created wealth, according to research. Yes. Okay. Yeah, but we're going to move on to another paper you did that may be controversial to some, but I just find it interesting. The relationship between colonialism and democracy. It is titled "On the Democratic Legacy of Colonialism."
Yeah. So what we find there. So first of all, it's a paper that I wrote now some 12 years ago. But the main exercise we do is that we kind of collect data on all former colonies. We find that there are 143 of them that are currently states, and we trace the date of colonization, which is not always very exact, but we try to establish a date, and also year of independence. And what we basically do in the paper is that we kind of characterize these process of colonization and decolonization. So it's really a paper mainly about establishing some stylized facts about colonialism. And then in the end, we also look at the duration, the impact of the duration of colonialism on levels of democracy. We find that typically, actually, the duration of colonialism seems to have had a positive impact. It's positively correlated with levels of democracy today. I don't think the main contribution is actually trying to find one super tight explanation for this. I think, and one should be very clear about that, colonialism has had so many negative impacts on societies. There's no doubt about that. Even the extinction of certain population groups and so on. The destruction of indigenous cultures and all that. But basically what we're basically doing there is, after having, assembled this new data on the dates of colonization and so on, we find that duration of colonial rule seems to have a positive impact on democracy. Other peoples have picked up on this. It's also related to the identity of the colonizer. For instance, British colonies with a strong rule of law seem to have had a more beneficial later development than other colonies. But so one should not interpret this as a kind of normative finding that Western colonial rule has always been good.
No.
Far from it.
Colonialism is an expensive system. However, it is not unique to Westerners. Africans and Asians also engage in colonialism, but on average, Western colonialism seem to have produced some positive development. So, for example, Sacredot in an old paper notes that there's a positive relationship between island incomes and colonialism, and he referred to the British and the Americans as being superior. British colonialism is quite fascinating to study. Some have argued that it is linked to democracy, higher per capita incomes, and better academic performance. So, for example, there is a paper comparing education in British Cameroon to French Cameroon, and the paper gave the edge to the British.
Yeah.
And I think a reason for this is that In British colonies, education was decentralized. They allowed the churches to tailor a curriculum to suit the needs of the masses, whereas the French often intervened in the management of education. There's actually another paper on this topic by Maradi, but that's for another time.
Yes.
But Ola, I also read your paper titled On the Institutional Legacy of Mercantilist and Imperialist Colonialism. I think our audience would love to hear your take.
Yeah, it's basically, I mean, this was one of the earlier versions or earlier kind of approaches that led up to this paper in 2009 in Journal of Comparative Economics. So it started off actually as a comment on Acemoglu Johnson Robinson's famous paper from 2001 on reversal of fortune among colonies, showing that that some colonies that were very heavily exposed to certain types of disease, like once again contagious, like malaria and so on, that they had actually had a worse development. So when I looked at that data, and they look at former colonies, when I looked at their data, and they have data on 64 colonies, it was very clear that it's really two waves of colonizations that happen. One that I refer to as the mercantilist wave, which is the early wave when the Spaniards and the Portuguese colonized countries, and also to some extent also the British in the 1500s. So basically that wave starts in the early 1500s and then is focused on America. But that basically ends by 1820, when most of the South American countries, for instance, South American former colonies, become independent. And then there's another wave, and this wave was characterized by, for instance, search for gold, and in an era when it was generally believed that the more gold you collected, the better for the home country, so to speak. Whereas the imperialist era is basically starts with the Berlin Conference in the 1880s, and it's focused on Africa, when the colonial powers, with ascending Germany being also important, divide up Africa. And this second wave starts in the 1880s. Is the kind of race for Africa, the kind of dividing up of Africa with a ruler, with very unnatural borders and so on. And that ends in 1960. So it's two very distinct colonial experiences. And it wasn't recognized, I think, at the time that they had very different impacts also.
Yes.
On related developments.
Yeah. And in your paper, you contend that during the imperialist age, and ideas of liberalism and equality were more prevalent, and this impacted colonialism.
Yeah.
You can just talk about that briefly.
Yeah, I mean, this is once again very diverse, and I think there's a certain difference between British and other colonies. So, I mean, on the whole, it seems that British colonies were more conducive to potentially a stronger sense of human rights, in a sense, not super strong in that period either. Whereas in other colonial powers, the most infamous example being, of course, the Belgian rule in Congo, where it was more of a pure extractive economy, where the king basically just extracted rubber for exports and more or less enslaved the whole population, which has been described in some very nice books by Adam Hochschild, for instance. I mean, there are some horrific examples of extraction also during the imperialist era, but at least in some parts, it actually led to the development of emergence of an educated elite in many of these former colonies that then for instance, Nkrumah in Ghana and so on, that then took over at independence, and probably have been pretty important for later levels of democracy as well. There was a reversal during the 70s in many of these countries with military dictatorships, and then after 1990, more of democracy again. So it's been a rough process since independence, but on the whole, it was a very different experience from the imperialist era, which also included the massive disappearance of millions of indigenous Americans in disease and conquest.
Yes, and the identity of the colonial power is important. So for example, I read a paper once arguing that British colonialism engendered a stronger civil society. So for example, in some British colonies, strikes were popular, but they did not become revolutionary due to the nature of civil society that originated in British colonies.
Mm.
So the British had a tendency to build institutions when they colonized new islands. So for example, they would create institutions to promote science or culture. Even in India, some have said that the British rediscovered Indian nationalism and indigenous Indian culture. And
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with Matthew Lange. He argues that Spanish colonialism was particularly pernicious because of its extractive nature.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with that argument?
Yeah. No, his work is almost the same period time, I think, as mine, and he's developed this at greater length.
Yes, but we're going to wrap up soon. But before we do so, I wanted to talk about Asimugla and Robinson, because Asimugla and Robinson are cited by nearly all the papers I've been reading.
Yeah.
Let's be serious, Professor. There's a difference between relative wealth and absolute wealth. Countries in the Latin American region became relatively poorer, but objectively, they're richer today based on absolute standards.
Well, it depends a little bit on what you refer to. I think it's very different kind of. I mean, on average, South American, some Latin American countries in general are richer than African countries. That's true. If you look at Chile, Brazil, Argentina, of course, and also in the Central America, like Costa Rica, of course, they're I mean, fairly prosperous countries in many ways. But then you have Venezuela, which is going in exactly in a much worse direction, and some other bad examples. So I mean, it's pretty heterogeneous also in Latin America.
Yeah, so for example, Spain and Portugal were the original extractive empires, and Asimugla and Robinson in their research admit that the Aztecs were extractive. Therefore, if they had continued on that path, more than likely they would have ended up like Spain or Portugal and not the Netherlands or Sweden. So are we overestimating the role of colonial institutions?
Oh, that's a difficult question. No, I don't think. I mean, in America, they are extremely important because they actually transformed societies in such a fundamental way. Also, because many of the indigenous Indians died, and there was an import of black slaves, which are now currently an important part of the population, as well as whites living there, which became a so in that sense, I think the colonial institutions are very important in those states. Yes, I think the research by Asimugla, Johnson, Robinson have shown this in a big number of papers, the importance of institutions. I don't perhaps subscribe to all their analysis, but I think they've been absolutely fundamentally important for stimulating research in this area, and have done some very, very important contributions.
And this is why I'm happy to be speaking to an expert like yourself, because pre-colonial institutions are becoming more central to understand the development of countries in Africa and other parts of the developing world. So, for example, I theorize that there is a positive relationship between the ability of a pre-colonial empire to appropriate foreign cultures and modern development. So, for example, Thomas McCaskey has a paper called Innovation, Eclecticism, and it details the Asante Empire in its relation to the Western foreign cultures, and revealingly, Ghana, the Asante Empire dominated the Gold Coast, so we now refer to Asante as Ghana, but quite revealingly, Ghana has had a better economic trajectory than other countries in Africa. It's more likely to accept reforms, and based on my own unscientific analysis so far, I attribute it to the legacy of the Asante Empire. So I think that colonialism, its effects are disappearing, and this is actually the view of someone called Maitland. He wrote a paper for Cambridge. Colonialism is the effects of colonialism are disappearing, and we should give primacy to pre-colonial institutions.
No, there's actually a paper by Jen Aioli, I think, on pre-colonial institutions in Africa, and as you say, I think especially there is along the Sahel belt of particularly Western Africa, there were a number of state-like formations before colonial era. I think Asante was one of them, but there were also others. For instance, Mali had a kingdom, and there were other kingdoms. So there were some experience of states before. Also in Congo, there was a Congo kingdom. In Uganda, there was the Buganda kingdom, and so on. So we know that within Uganda, there's still actually a king, and that tribe connected with the king has a particular status, and so on. So I agree. I mean, we probably haven't studied pre-colonial institutions enough in Africa, for instance.
Yeah, and yes, and Ola?
Yep.
Yeah, the last point is on Botswana. We do know that in pre-colonial Botswana, institutions impose constraints on the authority of leaders, and Botswana has been an expert in reform. So I think the area of research is fascinating, and maybe you should take it up.
Yes, that would be fun.
All right, but it was a pleasure
there's
speaking.
So much to study.
Yes, but it was a pleasure speaking to you, Ola. Bye.
It was great fun. Thank you.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.